Hey everyone, and welcome back once again to our ongoing coverage of international organization. And this week we are focusing on, as the title says, organization and disorganization in international global governance. And more specifically, if the picture means anything, international economic global governance. Now, if you went through already chapters 8 and 9 of the textbook, and you got my email saying you can kind of skip through 8, I really want you to focus more on 9, you can probably come away with one thematic story. And that is that economic approaches to global governance, right, especially when we focus on those institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, or strategies like the Washington Consensus, which approach developing states through economic technocratic lenses, oftentimes work to produce the very problems in social democracy and developmental well-being that Chapter 9 kind of alludes to. So in other words, economic approaches to global governance, I don't want to say directly lead to the social and the institutional and the political problems, but they certainly exacerbate a lot of the issues here. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to, sound like, one of those angry lefties in this lecture. And I, can say this because, 30 years on since, let's say, the end of the Cold War, and at least 25 years since the outset of neoliberal globalization, we're looking at the world today in the wake of the 2008-9 economic crisis, the rise of a number of political extremist groups in response to the limits, and in some cases even failings, of neoliberal approaches to development, modernization, and democracy. And so while I'm not here to suggest that free market capitalism is wrong, is problematic, is criminal, right, far from it, I am here to, if you want some abstract, if you want a little blurb for what we're going to be talking about over the next hour, is that economic approaches to developing states alone cannot solve a number of larger issues in the political, the social, even the economic, in that sense, right? Especially when economic approaches tend to be top-down, externally imposed, cookie-cutter solutions that actually end up creating more problems than, solving the ones that currently exist. So, in an effort to create, a thematic narrative for this week's discussion here, all right? I want you to think about, really, whether or not, economic global governance, creates the positive, scenarios that its proponents would like for you to think, or whether the positive scenarios, the positive results that do actually result in themselves create new problems, new class cleavages, new political tensions, and kind of leads us, sort of to where we are, pessimistically, in the world today. Right? So, with all of that said, we have a lot of stuff to cover this time around, and I think the best way to begin is to root ourselves within some kind of historical understanding of sort of where we are in 2020. And I would like to, welcome you, if you don't know that you are already in it, in what we have over the past, 2.5 decades referred to as the second great age of global capitalism. Right? The second great age of global capitalism. It was a term coined by Robert Gilpin, who is, I believe, still a political economist, or more specifically, an international political economist. And Gilpin had noted that the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet-supported single-party protectionist political economic system, created the conditions of Pax Americana, right? The stuff that we had talked about last week, which not only includes American unipolar hegemony, but in many situations defines Pax Americana as really the triumph of transnational market capitalism. Right? If we were to really look at what defines American global hegemony and even the world today in a post-American hegemonic period, it's not America's military prowess. It certainly isn't America's diplomatic acumen. It's their economic reach, right? It is the idea that what won the Cold War was not Thomas Jefferson versus Karl Marx, but Adam Smith versus Karl Marx, right? So, don't think of Karl Marx the politician. Think of Karl Marx the economist. At least that was the initial assumption in the 1990s. In that Pax Americana also comes with the advent of the, second great age of globalization. The first great age being that 2.5-decade period that bookended the 19th to the 20th centuries. All right, now I'm going to assume that many of you are not, industrial historians here, but roughly about a little bit more than 100 years ago, at least as far as Western Europe and North America were concerned, historians kind of retroactively regard it as really the first great age of global capitalism, really brought on by the golden age of colonialism, sort of the apparent triumph of industrialism, and, a period that kind of lasted from, let's say, roughly the 1880s to about 1914, right, the outbreak of the First World War. And then the ensuing, 85 or so years between the beginning of World War I and the end of the Cold War in 1989 to 1992, sort of creates this gap between one age of global capital and a second, almost a resumptive age of global capitalism, in which globalization, what we understand today, is characterized by a continuous breaking down of barriers, right? Political barriers, economic barriers, information barriers, the ways in which news and information, people can travel, people can communicate today, without even realizing it, is something that was incredibly difficult to conceive of as recent as 30 or so years ago. So when we talk about the breaking down of barriers, we are really talking about the triumph of capital democracy, right? This fusion of capitalism with sort of a democratic brochure cover to make it look appealing and palpable. And, the United States' unipolar hegemony around the world was, I think, accentuated by this unfettered flow of capital from the industrial world to the developing world, right? Beginning as early as 92, 93, but really taking off around 94, 5, and 6, to the point where we just, look at the world today and, with the exception of, let's say, North Korea or, I don't know, Bhutan, for completely two different reasons, the world is integrated. Right, integrated, interdependent, operating within one, network of global capital, global information, sort of global ideology. It is really the dawn of the digital age, not just in digital economics, but digital information, digital ideology. The fact that I am offering this class to you asynchronously, some of you could very well some of you could have decided that you were going to be a remote student this semester and take it outside of New York, right? One of you could have, logged into this class from Argentina. Another one could have logged in from the Czech Republic. A third could have, logged in if you wanted to go back to where, your parents came from, Grenada. And there would be no problems. In another class, I have a student that is taking it from California. And we are talking very seriously within the upper echelons of administration of really considering online degrees within Connolly College, to the point where, international students that want to get a degree at an American university but don't want to, pay the money to come here or pay for the living expenses can kind of stay where they are up to the senior year and, save on money or whatever. And, I just talk into a microphone and, run my little PowerPoint and, off we go. So the reason why I'm giving you this long-winded description is because the world in which we live in today is largely, if not entirely, defined, right, by digital information, right, globalized digital information. And it was widely regarded as just this unassailable, matter-of-fact way of life. I think up until around 2008. Now, this is sort of the real simplistic way of differentiating between the good old days of globalization and, what we can call today sort of the underside, the dark underside of neoliberalism. There were problems, to be sure, well before 2008, but these problems really didn't hit liberal democratic countries. And this is also kind of one of those little, side comments that I feel is necessary to make, is that, we don't acknowledge that there are problems in our community, our world, our country, whatever, unless the affluent liberal tends to be inconvenienced. So, for lack of, better, place marker, I will consider the Great Economic Recession of 2008, which by some accounts is still going on. By others, it was quickly solved about a year later. I leave the question mark open for you all to figure out whether we're still reeling from that recession or whether we have emerged from it. But the point is that 2008 was a watershed moment in which a small group of people beforehand acknowledged and recognized the limits and weaknesses of neoliberal economic solutions now becomes a front and center point of discussion within mainstream media, and is something that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, especially if the age of globalization is driven by an expanding and growing market. Any novice in economic theory would know that markets will wax and wane. There will be periods of, boom and periods of contraction. And so if you don't prepare for these things, and you just assume that the good times are going to keep rolling in and day out, well, then you're in for a rude awakening when something like 2008 comes along. But I think what makes 2008 even more problematic than it might have been is because those states that latched onto the principles of neoliberal economic solutions to all of life's problems effectively weakened and dismantled much of the institutional apparatuses of their states, which pinned democracy and social welfare to an expanding economic market. And so once again, as long as prosperity continued, one could remain guardedly optimistic that a whole bunch of additional problems, unemployment, social welfare, standards of living, among just to give three, would continue to increase. But the minute that the market contracts, the minute that the banks stop lending, worse, the minute that creditors start calling in their debts, and it's very quickly apparent how poor people can become. It's very quickly apparent at how many people are living paycheck by paycheck. And it is also very quick to point out that, and this is the real pessimistic acknowledgement of the week, is that when people in power, especially technocrats, realize that they can only save one thing, they can either continue to maintain economic solvency or they can work to prop up democratic social welfare, but they can't have both. They will choose economic solvency over, and sadly at the expense, of democratic social welfare. So it is not an anomaly, folks, to note that in the last, 12 or so years, we have seen repeated efforts by international organizations, both formal as well as private, to defend, prop up, and empower, free market capital flows at the direct expense of economic well-being and human development. Now, this is seen most prominently, unfortunately, in Africa. But we also see problems of poverty, unemployment, and an unmooring of social democracy from global capital in a number of developed states around the world: Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, even here in the United States. Right? Donald Trump's election in 2016 is no anomaly, is no fluke. Now, as I mentioned to my graduate class this past week, what was really the surprise in 2016 wasn't so much the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump did not win 2016. Hillary Clinton lost. And that's important to understand, because it's not Hillary herself, but it's what Hillary represented, right? The old neoliberal status quo way of doing things, in which faith in the free market, the unfettered free market, would solve all of life's problems. That was met with an electoral rejection. And yes, you could say that the popular vote affirmed her as president, but where she lost out were the states that were most significantly affected economically from 2008, and that was Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and to a lesser extent Florida. Although Florida political culture is just weird, but Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Right? These are still predominantly working class white communities. And their decision to go with Trump has less to do with their sociocultural values than their frustration and, utter, rejection of this constant plea to continue having faith in an economic system that has undermined the quality of life for many people who do not have the type of, economic advantage or leverage that more affluent communities do. And so with this assessment of where we are over the past 10 to 12 years, right, it's important to note that the role of international organization has its limits. It's not to say that it's irrelevant, but I like pointing out both the capabilities and incapabilities of transnational groups, as well as the way in which the international system is structured in handling this economic imbalance since 2008. And the thing to note here is that international organizations, they have the unique role in identifying, coordinating, and directing economic global governance in the promotion of transnational cooperation and regional development. In other words, it's a nice way of saying that organizations from, as large and as pervasive as the United Nations, to as financially technocratic as the Washington Consensus, they're all very good at noting, right, the problems in economic imbalance. They're also very good at, coming up with a policy report for what needs to be done to, alleviate the problems of poverty in the less, developed regions. However, the big issue is transforming policy recommendations into actual implementation. And this is something that I'm very upset to acknowledge is a big plague in social sciences. Not just in poli-sci, right, but in psychology, in history, in anthropology, in economics, right? We're really good at, looking at a situation and crunching numbers and pointing our finger and saying, there's your problem right there. But in terms of coming up with an actual policy solution, that's where things just kind of get bogged down in debate and, endless bureaucratic wrangling. So the problem with international organizations is that they lack the fundamental powers to execute and implement reform for the betterment of all people. And I put reform in quotes because reform's a loaded term. Right? Reform is a loaded term in this day and age because policymakers, economic wonks, number crunchers, statisticians, technocrats, they use the word reform in a rather laboratorial approach, right? Reform in this case is getting states to conform to a number of policies and decision-making situations that may very well undermine and weaken the whole idea of well-being for their people in the immediate future. But the idea is kind of like the Copenhagen criteria for the European Union, is that we're not really looking at short-term fallouts. We're looking at, and when we say we're looking at, we're really hoping for, long-term prosperity, right? So it might hurt to make a number of structural adjustments in the first 5 to 10 years of our series of loans, but if you follow our recommendations, and, look, technocrats don't really have to worry about political fallouts, the rise of populism, any electoral reckoning for their jobs. So they could kind of make these policy recommendations in the sterilized economic laboratories that they live in and still call it reform without acknowledging any of the repercussions. So that's why I put reform in quotes, because these organizations oftentimes make it the vocation of states, and more specifically state governments, to implement these reforms, right? Whether they are austerity measures, whether they are wide-scale efforts in industrial privatization, selling off of redundant industries and factories to external buyers who may very well just cannibalize the factory, throw 80% of its workers out, and reuse the materials for something completely different. The problem here is that reform is not really the responsibility of international organizations, but more so the responsibility, the vocation of states, and more specifically state governments, which oftentimes are put in a very precarious position because state governments are forced to consider models of this type of reform that are directly detrimental to their own citizens and their economic long-term well-being. But if they choose to ignore these reforms, external organizations that are offering loans or consultations for restructuring so you can become more attractive to foreign investment may decide to look elsewhere. So in other words, state leaders are kind of caught between two very, precarious positions. On one level, the idea is we want our, undeveloped but, relatively okay country to become competitive within the global capital market. But in order to do so, right, we have to go through a lot of renovations, right? Think of it like this, all right? Think of it like this, all right? I don't know if any of you ever seen that show on TV. I don't even know what it's called, but there's this show about this guy that, either, rescues financially troubled bars or restaurants, right? I think it's, bar rescue. It doesn't matter what the title is, right? I only see a couple of seconds of it here or there. Right? They call it, these troubled, financially struggling bars, restaurants, usually family run. They call in this dude from the outside who is going to, save the business. And, the idea is that if you're going to call on his services, right, he has, free reign. He has the right of way to basically tell you what you need to do. And if you have to fire half your workers, if you have to gut if you have to gut your restaurant, basically just reduce it to little more than, sewage pipes and light fixtures, and then start from scratch, right? That's going to cost money. Tens of thousands of dollars. You're already financially struggling to make your restaurant or your bar work. But the guy on the outside is saying, look, in order to make it work, you're going to have to spend money in order to make money. So that's going to put you in even more debt. So you gut the interior of the restaurant, you get rid of, the furniture, the decor, you change the menu around, you up the price, you fire half the workers, you get rid of that one person that's been with you for, 45 years, but is really just, not, a team player, whatever it happens to be, right? You make a number of painful decisions for the sake of realizing that this is going to hopefully, keep your fingers crossed, save the bar, save the restaurant, right? And you reopen, after, 2-3 months of, internal renovation, and, the place looks almost completely different. The only thing that is the same is the address, the phone number, and maybe a few items on, the menu. But other than that, the whole place is just gutted from the inside. This is reform. right? This is reform. And this is sort of like, well, this is what you need to do in order to save your business. So for a state that is seeking external financial support, whether we need to, whether we need to take out some loans, whether we are suddenly now in debt from, decades beforehand and we need to pay off these loans in order to get additional loans or additional investment, we need to make a couple of really painful decisions, right? Okay, so we decide to do this, but this happens really at the expense of at least half your population. Because now suddenly, right, unemployment goes up. And I'm not saying that, job security was guaranteed beforehand, but it becomes increasingly difficult to find work, or if you do find work, to get a job that pays you enough to pay your own expenses and bills. And so suddenly we begin to realize the sort of the underside of neoliberalism is that it benefits really the people at the top, but it oftentimes continues to hurt financially, and even psychologically, people at the middle or at the bottom. And so international organization, might be more incapable of, handling long-term problems beyond, economic grievances and concerns. So that leads us to finally, look at, well, what exactly then is neoliberalism? I've been talking about it. I have been mentioning it kind of off and on in this class. And, if you've had me before, you know that you're not going to have a class with me without some kind of, hey, let's take a pause and figure out what neoliberalism is. And, I do this not because I want to get you to hate it. I want you to realize what defines the world today, or at least what is still one of the competitive ideologies in the world that might not be the hegemonic structure anymore. I think that was ruptured really between 2008 and 2016. But if the presidential election next week means anything, it is that the campaign of Joe Biden is largely representative of an attempt, one last attempt by neoliberal technocrats to try to reclaim power before all is lost to either the national populism of Donald Trump or the working class populism of a Bernie Sanders. Okay? So neoliberalism is many things, but for the purposes of this class and this lesson in economic governance, neoliberalism is first and foremost a belief in what I call free market fundamentalism. Free market fundamentalism. In other words, neoliberalism is the understanding that the market, right, the free market, will be able to solve all social, political, and economic problems. So if we accept neoliberalism as free market fundamentalism, it is in which social, political, and economic problems all rely on the market to address and solve. Okay? So if, let's say, your neighborhood is, afflicted by economic blight, rising unemployment, no investment, jobs are, have been moved elsewhere. Now, there's lots of ways that you can solve this problem politically, socially, and what have you. A neoliberal approach does not consider any political, social, or cultural considerations. Neoliberalism will look at a blighted neighborhood and say, I know exactly what you need. You need a Trader Joe's. You need a shopping center. If you're really lucky, we're going to give you a Whole Foods, right? And in this sense, neoliberalism is kind of like gentrification. It's like financial gentrification, where instead of addressing the underlying socioeconomic or socio-political problems, we're going to throw money at the problem in hopes that either A, it will go away, or more likely B, the people that just are, part of the poverty issue will be priced out of the neighborhood, right? Will just be kind of forced into someone else's backyard, and we don't have to worry about them anymore. So neoliberalism is really a top-down technocratic solution in the name of the promotion of development, growth, and modernization. Okay? And I think that the technocratic solution is very important to note because technocrats take charge of the problems instead of elected officials, instead of state elites. So the other thing to note about neoliberalism is that it is free market fundamentalism amid the withdrawal of state intervention. Right? Neoliberalism argues that the less obstacles, the less intervention the state has on the market, the better the outcome. So, if you know anything about economics, neoliberalism is kind of like the lazy college student's understanding of Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand, right? So it's like if you ever read Adam Smith, who is widely regarded as like the father of modern capitalism, you would realize that The Wealth of Nations, the book that he wrote, is kind of like the Bible for capitalism, for free markets, enterprise. But Adam Smith is not the social Darwinistic, libertarian that many people today like to consider him to be. Adam Smith was very, very much a proponent of the state working in tandem with the market to provide a sense of social welfare. So whereas the market might operate independently of state, complete regulation, the state still had the responsibility to tax, and it also had the responsibility to allocate taxation revenue for public goods and public welfare. That part of the Wealth of Nations is usually in the book, is in the part of the book that, more, speed readers of the theory stopped reading, right? It's kind of like if you read only chapter 1 of The Wealth of Nations, and the chapter 1 is already about 60 pages. So you kind of, felt like you got the gist of it by page 30, and you closed the, 800-page book, and you're like, okay, that's all I need to know. That's neoliberalism. Okay? That is neoliberalism. It is a very non-political, almost apolitical, technocratic solution to the promotion of development, growth, and modernization, which oftentimes comes in little more than international loans that are contingent on structural accommodations. So the technocrats are not going to go to your state, go to your country in the same way that the guy who rescued bars will say, okay, I will take charge. I will rip everything up. I will bring in contractors. I will rewrite your business plan. No. Neoliberal technocrats at this point just basically say, if you need money, state A, right? If you need money to pay off your loans or to start, expanding your industries, whatever it is that you want, right? You need to make a number of structural changes to your country in order for us to effectively lend you the money, right? You can't just ask us, hey, can I borrow $10 billion? It's like, no. $10 billion will be contingent on making a number of structural changes, right, within your country. And that usually means reducing as many institutional barriers and obstacles as possible to the free flow of capital. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, I'll get to that, in just a couple of seconds here. But in so many words, it means, disbanding any unions, privatizing your industries, making any outside investment ventures as little tax, responsible to, practically nothing, effectively opening your country up to the fate of the global free market. And the payoff, or at least the marketing issued payoff, is that, your state is going to lay itself bare, and you're going to throw yourself at the mercy of the markets. But here's the payoff, folks. If you do what we say, and we decide to invest in your country, well, you're going to get a whole bunch of consumer goods from the West that your ordinary citizens will just absolutely love, right? You're going to get McDonald's, and you're going to get Coca-Cola, and you're going to get American clothes and American appliances, and you're going to be able to, buy American or German or British goods, Consumerism is a large part of neoliberalism and consumerism. If you ever really wanted to know about the ideology of that, I mean, it is the idea that communal responsibility, collective welfare, is now utterly replaced with an emphasis on individual happiness. Okay? In so many words, to make it as easy as possible for you all, retail therapy. Right? Consumerism is retail therapy. Consumerism is, yeah, you might not have the best health care anymore, and yeah, you might not be able to have a guaranteed job. But if you do have some money at the end of the month to spend, well, you can go crazy at the shopping mall, and you can buy yourself something from Best Buy or IKEA or whatever it is, and make yourself feel good because look at what you've been able to accomplish, right? Material wealth, right? Material possessions as is a new way of defining your social standing, your social worth in the world, right? So consumerism, right, as I just said, is measured and defined through the acquisition of public goods. So we're no longer worried about the quality of public transportation. We're no longer worried about the quality of education. We're no longer worried about whether jobs in the manufacturing sector are going to provide wages that are livable for its participants in an age of globalization. In many respects, you may continue to work at a factory, but your salary will no longer be commensurate with what your qualifications are. And that is because we had to reduce salaries in order to get Mercedes or Microsoft or BASF to open up a plant in this developing country, right? Because if we demanded union, equal wages, if we demanded what someone in Germany or France or the United States would make, well, then there's no point in these foreign companies investing in yours because they could just as easily, A, keep their, factory back home, or B, put it in the next developing country that are more than happy to pay their workers pennies on the dollar. So this is also part of, unfortunately, a larger, attempt at economic global governance that has characterized much of the world since about 1990. And, there are lots of terms for it, but I think the term shock therapy is probably the best. And the ideas of economic shock therapy have been adopted by this, I don't know if it's an organization or whether it's a way of thinking or whether it's just a cabal of anonymous technocrats. But what we collectively call the Washington Consensus was largely America's economic foreign policy up until, I would say, recently, and may very well come back if Joe Biden is elected and he has the leverage to return us to the halcyonic, quote-unquote, good old days of Barack Obama. But the idea of shock therapy, which was almost unapologetically written down, word for word, in an article written by Jeffrey Sachs, one of the big architects, one of the big economic architects of shock therapy, in the January 1990 edition of the magazine The Economist. I'm sure that some of you have heard of this magazine, The Economist. And the article title was, I kid you not, titled "What is to be done?" in traditional Leninist top-down elitist measures. And the article effectively says that the fate of Eastern Europe, the fate of the recently emerging post-communist world, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others, okay? Their future is within a global capital network, right? It is within the network of states that are operating within commercial pacifism, United States, Canada, Britain, Germany, whatever. But in order to get them up to speed, because they are emerging from single-party closed economies, there is going to be no period of real transition, no hybrid model of social democracy. This is like the restaurant rescuer, right? This is an internal gutting. We are removing everything except four walls, the ceiling, the sewage pipes, and maybe the electrical wiring. That's it. Other than that, we are gutting everything in the country. It's a way of starting over, right? And so what exactly does shock therapy imply? First and foremost, it implies that the private sector, not the state sector, operates as the main vehicle for economic growth. So that means multinational corporations, external economic interests, the private market, not the state. And private markets will operate through their respective countries, putting pressure on these reforming states to make a number of rather painful concessions in the immediate future. And here we're talking about, 5-10 years of shock therapy readjustment. And what does that come with? Well, low rate inflation and price stability, a shrinking of your state bureaucracy, an elimination, if not, at the absolute least, a lowering of your tariffs, opening your country up to all sorts of foreign investment, and effectively a deregulation of your economy. Now, to the untrained, this doesn't sound all that bad, right? What could be wrong with a shrinking state bureaucracy? And what's wrong with price stability? What's wrong with lowering tariffs, right? What's wrong with opening up your country? Isn't this a great way of the people getting goods from the West? Well, technically, there's nothing wrong with that. But we are talking really about placing your country at the mercy of economic forces that are grossly advantaged over you. So if you're basically told, shut your state-run economies down, open your door, it literally is saying, to a thief outside, unlock your doors, open your windows, disable your alarm system, open up all of your, jewelry cases and safes. And you know what? While you're at it, open up the refrigerator as well, right? And just let us kind of have our way with you, right? Let us have our way. And in return, we'll leave our mark, in your country. This is how you're going to rise through, the channels of institutional, economic, political development, right? Now, the other problem with this, besides it being overtly invasive, is that the Washington consensus model of shock therapy was designed by quite possibly the most uninspiring, uncreative, mediocre technocrats that the United States at the time could ever possibly come up with. Okay? We are talking about people who went through college and grad school, maybe grad school, without taking anything outside of, courses in business, finance, and economics. Never took a single class in political science, never took a class in history or sociology. So has absolutely no consideration, let alone understanding, of the repercussions of what shock therapy could create for the country and its people. So to make matters even worse, these policies are, for the most part, macrostructural. In other words, cookie cutter. It's a one-size-fits-all policy. So whether you are Poland or Indonesia, whether you are Senegal or Serbia, okay, you are going to conform to the same boilerplate statements of restructuring, which does a number of things, right? One, it narrows your political and economic choices to basically be at the mercy, at the whim of outside investor criteria in order to get there. So the outside investors basically will weaken your state in return for the promise of possibly bettering your state, okay? And if you're thinking that this is blackmail, well, you run the risk of just being economically isolated, okay? And it is very simple. It is very clear to see that these policies favor economic solvency over democratic accountability. And the rationale among some of them is that, well, economic solvency will create democratic accountability, right? This is one of the big assumptions in liberal economic capitalist theory. And that is the presence of a free market will just by itself create the conditions for liberal democracy. And Adam Smith never said that. No, Adam Smith never said that. David Ricardo never said that. Milton Friedman did. But Milton Friedman is like the lazy college student that was supposed to write a paper about capitalism and Adam Smith, waited until the night before, and, like I said, read the first 25 to 30 pages of Chapter 1 of The Wealth of Nations, didn't bother to read the rest of it, and never considered that Adam Smith wrote a book before The Wealth of Nations called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, if you read Moral Sentiments before you read Wealth of Nations, you begin to realize that if you're going to capitalist, okay, you're going to have to keep a number of social democratic philosophies and principles embedded in your country in order to keep a whole bunch of people from going nuts. And that explains why many countries in Europe might have embraced free market capitalism at the end of the Second World War, but they never, ever touched the social welfare programs. They never got rid of national health care. They never got rid of, public education. They never got rid of cheap and affordable, if not free, public transportation. We here in the United States, we're a country that every 6 months, the tolls at the bridges and tunnels between New Jersey and New York will go up. Rent will go up every year, right? The MTA will up the tolls, the transit hikes on the subways and buses. And why? Screw you. That's why. Do we see any improvement in the subways? No, we don't. Do we see any improvement on the bridges and the tunnels? No, we don't. Do we see any improvement in the trains? No, we don't. But that's just the United States, right? Different topic, different period here. But this cookie cutter conditioning, right, will favor economic solvency over democratic accountability. And this is a very weak and careless understanding of commercial pacifism, because within theories of liberalism that we talked about in the beginning of the semester, right, commercial pacifism argues no two economically interdependent states will go to war with each other, which is true. The thing about commercial pacifism, however, is that it assumes that these two states place economic interdependency as the primary importance. And what's more, whenever we give examples, and I was deliberately giving these examples in the beginning of class, when we talk about the United States and Canada not going to war because they're economically interlinked, when Germany and France are not going to go to war together because they're economically interlinked, both countries in both scenarios are relatively developed. So it's not like these countries are in want of social welfare and an increase, a betterment in the quality of life. But when we talk about developing countries that need at least another, 50 or so years of statist development, we need economic protectionism. We need the empowerment of the working class. We need some kind of fail-safe to, protect nascent markets within these countries that at the period of, at the period of observation might not be competitive, but give it 30, 40 years, and they might be able to stand up on their own. But all of this is taken away right at the period when these countries need it the most, when they are transitioning from authoritarianism into some kind of democracy. So the idea is that you will transition from authoritarian rule not to democracy first, but to an integrated component of a transnational economic capitalist system first, with the idea that that should, over time, kind of, make you a democracy. Something like that. You might not be, Switzerland or Austria, but, you're going to elect your officials rather than, overthrow them in military coups. So this type of shock therapy is not so much a resumption of Keynesian economics as it is really neo-Keynesian. Now, Keynesianism, I'll be very quick with this, Keynesian economics is the idea that a free market exists within a country, And the state takes kind of a step back in allowing the free market to kind of do its own thing. However, the state does not remain ignorant of the free market. The state will intervene when the market seems like it needs help. So I like to think of Keynesianism as, we're all at the beach, and the state is the lifeguard, just kind of sitting there, kind of half in, half out, minding its own business, watching everybody else kind of run around and swim in the ocean, And the thing is that whenever somebody swims out of bounds or swims out too far, right, the lifeguard will blow the whistle. And for whatever reason, whenever the lifeguard blows the whistle, you kind of know that it's for you. And you kind of turn around and they're like, hey, come back, come back. And you're like, oh, okay, right? So you're in this little playing field, this acceptable playing field. As long as you're in this playing field, the state doesn't care, right? When you go out of that playing field, the state will intervene, okay? That's Keynesianism. This neo-Keynesianism is that the state is now completely denuded of any kind of responsibility, and any possible intervention, any possible regulation, any possible whistleblowing is now going to be done by the very international financial institutions that are lending you the money with these conditions and these criteria. So even in this case, the state, which would want to intervene sometimes when they're like, oh my God, the level of unemployment is rising. The level of poverty is increasing in these areas where factories and other industrial enterprises have now been shut down and where there's no money to, job train them. The state would normally intervene. In this sense, neo-Keynesianism, it's actually the World Bank, it's the IMF, it's the Washington Consensus, it's, whatever it is that's like, well, we'll get to it eventually. Right now, what they're really worried about is what does the capital look like? The former East Germany is a really good example of this, right? The former East Germany was basically gutted of all political and economic institutions after reunification. And foreign investment just poured into Berlin. If you lived in Berlin, life was good. That's where all the investment, that's where all the construction, that's where all the modernization went. Why? Because Berlin is now the new capital of Germany, and we're going to make Berlin, one of the major cities of Europe. But even today, if you go into the eastern sections of Germany, you drive 10 kilometers outside of Berlin, and you are in Germany's version of the Rust Belt, right? You are in towns and smaller cities that are economically dilapidated. The quality of life is much, much poorer. Maybe Dresden is the only other place in Eastern Germany. But a whole bunch of places, in Western Pomerania, in Saxony, and other places, especially outside of those cities, it is poor. It is run down. It ain't the Germany that you like to think of. And surprise, surprise, ladies and gentlemen, these areas of Eastern Germany are where much of Germany's political extremist movements are now manifesting, right? Either, populist left, or more likely, because of the world that we live in, the populist right. So if you kind of, take a survey of Germany and find out where are the largest, gatherings of neo-Nazism in Germany today, you'd find that they're almost all in the former East, outside of little woke Berlin, which is, of course, a gated community, right? So economic shock therapy, it's got its problems, right? It definitely has its problems. One of which is that shock therapy is, as I've been hinting at, overwhelmingly quantitative, right? It is a quantitative approach. It is a structural adjustment program that is interested in numbers only. It's a modern-day 5-year plan the Soviet Union used to have, right? I don't know if you know about these, right? 5-year plans back in the day, right? Soviet Union would basically say, all right, in 5 years, the country is going to be at this level of economic development, right? We're going to have output with these numbers. We're going to have industrial capabilities at those numbers, and go, okay? And you begin to realize within those 5 years, you don't really know how you're going to get there. But you realize that when those 5 years are up, you better make certain that those numbers are met, right? Now, there's two ways of meeting the numbers. You can do it the methodical way, or you can do it the random haphazard way. And you'd be surprised how quickly and how often the random haphazard way happens to be, right? If your goal is to meet the numbers in order to qualify for the next set of loans or in order to qualify for the next level of investment, you're going to meet those numbers by any means possible. And that is where a lot of people get burned behind the scenes. Like I mentioned in my graduate class a couple of weeks ago, if you want to meet the numbers, you can do it. It's going to be a painful way of meeting them. Can I go by car from the Verrazano Bridge to the Long Island Expressway in 10 minutes? Yes, I can. I have done it. Would I recommend doing it again? No. When did I do it? I did it, I think it was many, many years ago. I did it at like 2:30 in the morning. There was nobody on the road. Can you go from the Verrazano Bridge to the Long Island Expressway in 10 minutes? Yes, you can. I don't recommend doing it. And thank God there was not a cop there or a pothole or traffic, right? So it can be done, but it's a big gamble. It's a big risk to make, right? And so when you're trying to meet these numbers, surprise, surprise, right? The early 90s, especially in a place like Africa, we see the optimism of Africa's renaissance to about a decade or so later devolving into the African problem, okay? And the problem is really that many of these countries, which had, just recently, maybe about just a few decades ago, had emerged from previous decades of colonialism and just trying to, get on their feet, are now being told by external economic technocrats that if they ever hope to be part of the global economic system, they're going to have to make a number of structural adjustments to make them attractive to foreign investment. And at the end of the day, you know what that ultimately is? A new type of colonialism. So it's not a surprise that in order to meet these adjustments, in order to meet these criteria to get money, right, a lot of people are overlooked, their immediate lives are neglected, poverty is rampant, the quality of life in some of these countries is worse than you'd find in, Afghanistan. And then, without knowing the underlying reasons for the African problem, policymakers, the CNN crew, groups, whatever, will look at Africa today, scratch their heads and say, why is Africa the way that it is? Right? Is it just because Africans just have never had a history of any kind of development, And a lot of these conclusions are not only historically inaccurate, they're downright insensitive and not that far from being racist, as well. So the sobering reality is that economic solutions do not produce the intended democratic needs that many of these technocrats who, again, have little to no knowledge of political science or history actually intended, right? So externally imposed economic directives are largely designed without any regard to the economic well-being of the target audience. And, in a way, I can't chide the Washington Consensus or the European Union or any of these other organizations because, to be honest, I don't think that was in their mind to begin with. For them, if you are a bank, if you are a creditor, you're not interested. You're not interested in what the money does. You just want your money back, right? That's it. So if all they really care about are meeting the numbers, and these governments are responsible for meeting those numbers, surprise, surprise, there's going to be a backlash at some point. And that backlash is going to manifest in the form of populism and nationalism, as we see throughout Europe, the Middle East, and even Latin America. And without knowing why these movements manifest, we once again scratch our heads and say, oh my God, it's 2020. I thought we left racism and nationalism and xenophobia behind. It's like, I got news for you. This is not any legacy from the colonial period or the communist period or the Nazi period. This shit is now. There are a lot of people who otherwise would have been more than happy to just be private citizens living in a moderate, B to B minus functioning country. But because of these structural pressures on them, they've lost their jobs, they've lost the quality of life, the cost of living goes up, they can't go anywhere, their politicians are ultimately corrupt. So eventually they gravitate towards people like Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, and others, right? And, this is something that, we can certainly, bring up next semester in ethnic politics for those of you that want to, continue with this conversation. So, this also helps us to understand that economic global governance, it does produce, right, a number of winners, right? If you are on the receiving fortunate end here, yeah, you're going to get rich. You're going to, expand, you're going to move ahead, and you're going to be one of those people that, the New York Times op-ed section writes about lovingly and glowingly, right? You're going to be the people that Tom Friedman or Nicholas Kristof or any of these other, cursed, liberals, will look at and say, you see, the free market helps everybody else. You're going to overlook a larger group of what I'll just euphemistically call losers. Okay? The losers in the economic global governance race. And one way of looking at this is race to the bottom theory. I don't know how many of you have heard about this one before, but race to the bottom is something that within the developing world, right, especially the those peripheral countries in Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, these developing countries will compete with each other in underbidding for foreign investment and manufacturing at the direct expense of undercutting its own social welfare sectors. So, for instance, if, let's say, GM or Ford or Tesla or, Mercedes wants to build a, car factory somewhere in Southeast Asia, okay? The lucrative, the lucrative benefits of having Mercedes invest in your country is almost too good to be true. But Mercedes doesn't care where. It could be Thailand, it could be Laos, it could be Cambodia, it could be Vietnam, it could be Malaysia, it could be wherever, right? At the end of the day, Mercedes is going to let these 4-5 countries eat each other alive over who can produce the more lucrative and advantageous business plan. So if, let's say, Cambodia offers a business, proposal for Mercedes in which, Mercedes can pay Cambodian workers the equivalent of $1.25 an hour for, manufacturing on the assembly line that would, in Germany, require 30 euros an hour, or something like that, right? Was it Cambodia? Let's say Cambodia says $1.25 an hour for their workers. Vietnam can respond by saying, you know what, I can pay $1.15. Laos can turn them around and say, you know what, I'll give them $1. Malaysia can say, you know what, it's going to be a little painful, but we really want that Mercedes factory, 99 cents. Right? So you're basically underbidding each other to get that lucrative deal from a developed Western industrialized firm. And so what ends up happening is that the developing world will, as I said, underbid and undercut each other for who gets that job. And the winner is the one that could produce a business solution that pays their workers the cheapest, that offers the outside firm the largest tax incentive, if not, completely operating tax-free. It's kind of like the equivalent of, if you remember a couple of years ago, Jeff Bezos wanted to build a major Amazon tech hub, regional distribution center, whatever it was, in Long Island City. And in so many words, right, the city of New York was ready to hand over sovereignty of a major section of Queens to Jeff Bezos. In addition, they would actually pay him. They would pay him money to set up shop. And, New York was, I think, competing with Richmond and Atlanta or something like that, right? And, those that were in favor of this were like, oh, look at the jobs that will be created. It will help out the neighborhood. And usually those people saying that didn't live in the neighborhood. Those that lived in Long Island City were like, are you kidding me? I mean, it's already problematic as it is. Can you imagine the strain on the public transportation? Can you imagine the revenue that would be lost if Amazon basically just sets up its own fiefdom? Can you imagine the smaller jobs that would be forced out because of Amazon, right? And yeah, under pressure, de Blasio, did relent, but this is an example of race to the bottom. So the winners and losers are that, who are the winners? The ones that exploit the losers, the ones that are able to get free trade instead of fair trade. And if you know the difference between free trade and free trade gets you cheap stuff. Fair trade ends up providing a number of subsidies for products and services that come from less developed areas in the world, but you know that you're buying something from, the less developed area, so you're going to be paying a little bit more with the idea of hoping that your money goes towards, improving the infrastructure, paying the workers, improving, let's say the quality of life. If free trade wins out, right, we end up seeing these imbalanced geographical and demographic target zones of development that are surrounded by, comparative poverty and misery. It's what I call the boardwalk effect. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Atlantic City in New Jersey. You all remember, New Jersey is a little slice of heaven that I come from. But for as long as I can remember, right, I used to go down to AC, and the boardwalk, it's like any New Jersey boardwalk, right? The boardwalk on the beach, whatever. It's got its, it's got its fun houses, it's got its little, ice cream shops and its saltwater taffy. But in the 1970s, the city had made the decision to legalize gambling, right? And AC became like the second Las Vegas, or that was the hope, that it was going to become the second Las Vegas. And all the money coming in from the casinos would produce enough revenue for the city of Atlantic City, which by that point was increasingly poor, crime-ridden, and just impoverished. The money coming in from the casinos would provide all the revenue necessary for schools and roads and infrastructure, and it would, do to AC and South Jersey what Las Vegas ostensibly did to Nevada and Clark County by extension. And the problem with this is that in order to get these major companies and people like Donald Trump to build casinos in AC, the lucrative solution was you end up having your casinos like tax-free, or, the revenue generated from the casinos is like, 90% the house keeps, whatever it was, whatever deal was made in order to get the physical presence of the casino on the boardwalk. And the problem is that the AC boardwalk is a world unto itself. And you go 2 blocks in, away from the beach, and, you're in the ghetto. You're in the hood. And no one ever goes into AC, right? You drive down, you drive directly into the hotel parking garage, and that's it. You spend a day or two there, right? You blow your Social Security check. You might have some pizza from Two Brothers, eat some saltwater taffy, get a picture taken on the beach, maybe look at the convention hall and go, oh, wow, look at that organ. Get back in the car and go home. So nothing ever happens to the rest of AC. And this is something that we find in many developing countries around the world, where you'll get like target areas in, let's say, the capital, or some areas just outside the capital that are now effectively business parks for international companies that, dump all their money, all their resources, all their tech things. But it becomes a gated community. It had its own private security. It's got its own thick, high walls. Why? Because it keeps other people out. Or as I said in a previous lecture, it could be for this one, it could be for another class. Now, I remember seeing on TV those commercials for Jamaica. Come to Jamaica. Jamaica's wonderful. Look at these smiling, people in dreadlocks or whatever it is, right? And of course, the underlying theme in the commercial was, don't come to Jamaica. Come to the hotel resort, but please, for the love of God, don't ever leave the hotel grounds. And don't ever, ever, ever even think of going into the middle of Kingston. It's like Jamaica is great if you're at a private beach for white people. If you go into Jamaica, it's a whole different world. Now, if you love concrete jungle, right, and if you, find, speaking patois to be, an experience, well, knock yourself out, right? But you got to realize There's two Jamaicas. There's the Jamaicas for, the happy white people to go on the beach. And then there is kind of impoverished, working class, sort of, politically activist Jamaica that never really makes it, in the commercials. But two different worlds, right? Two different worlds. And so why do we get this? Because much of the financing, much of the economic regulation, much of the economic structuring is coming from more often than not, MNCs, multinational corporations, who are given large degrees of corporate sovereignty over the economic happenings in the country that they invest in. And this is how we get banana republics, right? Not the stores, right? But you all know what a banana republic is, right? The kind of the euphemistic slang term for a kind of, weak tin pot dictatorship in Latin America that survives largely on the revenue generated from like one major product. And bananas, you never really think about this. No, we really, really, really need to have a class on Latin American politics in poli-sci at LIU. I'm surprised that we don't. But the United States has been disastrous towards the development of Latin American society, any country south of the Rio Grande. Okay? And, if you go to the supermarket, you go to the banana section, you realize that really there's only two banana companies, Dole and Chiquita. And these two banana companies basically created their own private empire in the late 19th, much of the 20th century, by controlling the banana market in Latin America. In fact, even introducing bananas to be planted there and used for, a major source of revenue. I mean, the CIA coups have, I think, happened on more than one occasion because the CEO of either Dole or Chiquita called in and said, we need to get rid of an unruly politician who has the audacity to start dabbling in principles of social democracy. Get rid of this guy right now and put in some dictator that'll be amenable to our business interests. And this is how you get banana republics. I know I was going to sound like an unhinged lefty in this lecture, and I didn't intend to do so. But the point here is that economic approaches to state development from outside sources have very little regard for the well-being, of the inhabitants of said country. So, what can we do? If I have done my job once again in depressing all of you, I want to kind of move the discussion towards something a bit more proactive and optimistic. What can we do? Well, we are doing a lot. It's not like we're just sitting here kind of throwing our hands up in the air. It's still an uphill battle. The first thing that we can do is realize that development and well-being are not necessarily tied to macroeconomic global politics. And I think that in the wake of the 08-09 economic crisis, a lot of people have come to, sort of accept that. And more often than not, if you tend to be more on the, social democratic, public welfare side, you may believe that, both development and well-being are directly affected, negatively affected by macroeconomic global policies. The interesting thing is that in the globalized world today, some of the biggest, economic powers outside of Western Europe and the United States come from East Asia. Japan, South Korea, China, and, within China, the subsidiary, branch offices of Hong Kong and Taiwan, right? So whenever anybody asks, what's the matter with Africa? They always look at East Asia and say, why can't you be more like East Asia? Why can't you be more like these Asian tigers? Right? They got it right. Well, sort of. Sort of. The East Asian tigers, as everyone likes to get, attracted to, get, a little excited about, they got where they were by not deregulating. They got where they were by not opening up the state to abject foreign investment. The one time China did that, the one time China actually was like, okay, I'll open my borders up to the West, do as you will, we ended up with the Boxer Rebellion. Okay? We ended up with conditions that led someone like Mao Zedong to come to power in 1949. Okay? China 100 years ago ain't the China today. Right? China is China because of nearly unassailable state institutions that keep foreign economic powers out. So if you're a fan of protectionism, have I got a group of countries to show you, right? All of these, South Korea, China, Japan, among others, all adopted state-supported key industries through subsidization to increase their global competitiveness. Okay? So state leaders took it upon themselves to not open their country up to Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, Ford, or GM, but instead said, no, man, you know what? I want this Honda to work. I want this Toyota to work. I want this Hyundai to work. And that's the reason why today you can go to, if you need a car, you can buy a Hyundai instead of a Dacia. And if any of you have no idea what a Dacia is, well, congratulations. The global market took it away from you. Right? A Dacia was the national car of Romania. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and think, okay, when you think of Romania, you don't really think of a car country. But let me tell you something. 40 years ago, if I was to tell people 40 years ago that South Korea would be a major tech and automobile hub, you all would look at me like I was talking out of, like I was talking in a different language. Like if I was to tell you in 1980, better yet, 1970, that South Korea is going to be what South Korea is today, you'd be like, Rossi, I don't know what you're drinking, but can I have some? Because at that time, North Korea was doing exponentially better. But today, Hyundais, those things are on the road. Samsung, Hyundais and South Korean tech products are now rivaling and in many cases actually surpassing the older Japanese products. It also explains why China is the second largest economy in the world today. Right? Chinese economy is not because it is the home to every other sweatshop. Okay? The Chinese economy is also what it is because of its active statist policies. Right? When people complain about China not being a global player, when they complain about China not pegging their currency to the dollar, they're complaining because China should be a supplicating country. When Beijing is like, why should I be? Why should I be? Right? I don't have to. Britain can play by its rules. America can play by its rules. I'm China. I'm going to play by my rules. So what can we do is something that we in political science have been talking about also since the 1980s, and that is bring the state back in. The state has been, even before globalization told the state to take a hike, right? People have been saying the state has the authority, it has the resources, and it has the legitimacy to make a number of decisions, to implement a number of policies, to further, right, the development and the increase in human well-being and provide some kind of quality of life, right? The quality of life that we all kind of look at in Switzerland or Iceland or Germany has nothing to do with the culture, okay? Icelandic people are, by and large, overwhelmingly racist. They are unbelievably racist, right? Because their country is largely ethnocentric, right? Swiss are unbelievably conservative. And Germans, well, Germans are Germans, right? But the quality of life in those countries has not to do with the culture. It has a lot to do also with state decisions that feel like, a quality of life is necessary for stability and for public growth. It's just that simple. It's just that simple. The idea of Iceland or Switzerland or Germany or Austria having children in lunch debt is considered to be absolutely barbaric. They're like, what the hell is the matter with you? Right? No. That's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen at all. So what can we do? Well, we can increase international commitment to promote a quality of life beyond economic and financial measures. Right? And, to suggest that this is lacking, well, it's lacking only insofar as, once again, the organizations that are out there that have the power to do this are once again very good at saying what could be done, but don't really have that ability to implement it. So I introduce you once again to the United Nations. Right? You all remember this group of people, right? And, the United Nations at the turn of the previous century passed a number of, benchmark goals that they wanted met first by 2010, that didn't work, so they upped it to 2020. Now that didn't really work. Now they upped it to 2030. Yeah, when you make your own benchmarks, you can kind of change your deadline here. But the UN Millennium Development Goals, they're probably some of the boldest and most openly assertive efforts at trying to alleviate socioeconomic problems and grievances among the poorest of the world. And these are things that we can certainly bring up next semester in my UN class if you're interested in delving more into it. But in so many words, to keep the conversation going here, right? The UN Millennial Development Goals number about 8 or more, big target things, right? Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve material health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. I would imagine at this point COVID has been added to that. Ensure environmental sustainability and develop a global partnership for additional development. Okay? Now, these are very broad-based goals, which, at first read, you think these are very noble. These should be followed, and anyone who wants to do this, there's probably a job opening somewhere in ECOSOC for you to, play around in, right? Especially in environmental sustainability, right? Where have we gone by 2020? Well, the results are mixed, but they are by and large positive. Right? They are by and large positive. Right? Let's just kind of look through each one by one. So the first goal, the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. In 1990, about 50% of all people living in developing countries lived on less than $1.25 a day. And at the same time, 24% of the people in developing countries in 1990 were undernourished. Right? About 35 years later, the number of impoverished in developing countries has been reduced to 22%, so that 50% has been more than halved. And as far as people that are undernourished, we are almost about half, where it's now been reduced to about 15%. Now, the progress was mostly seen in China and Southeast Asia, with the worst results being in Africa. And if you just listen to what I had said before about the East Asian tigers, it's not that hard to understand why these targets have been reduced in Southeast Asia, because the states are more powerful. They have more leverage. In Africa, and Africa's a big, we've got over 50 countries, so, the results vary. But in some of the worst, places, the states are overwhelmingly weak, have little to no leverage, not even outside the capital, but probably outside the capital district. So it is interesting to point out once again the importance of the state as a facilitator in making or breaking international policies and recommendations. All right, goals 2, 3, and 4. Goal number 2, achieve universal primary education. Today, 90% of all children are attending primary school. That is a major increase in where we were in 1990. Goal number, what was this? I just lost track of here. Goal number 3, the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. We see today in 2020 the near equity of men and women, boys and girls, females and males, at primary education, although there are still disparities that are persisting at higher levels of education, particularly in upper academia, as well as the labor market. Okay. What about a reduction in child mortality? This is goal number 4. Child mortality has been reduced by about 50%, but yet within the child mortality rates today, 80% remain in Africa. So we see that Africa just kind of remains much more of a problem than many other parts of the world. Goal number 5, improvements to maternal health. Okay? Again, we have seen an uptick. There's been an overall decrease in maternal mortality, although it is still comparatively higher in Africa. Goal number 6, what about combating AIDS, malaria, and other diseases? This is kind of a never-ending battle, right? Because as soon as we develop vaccines and solutions for one major pandemic, another one, emerges. So we had just figured out how we can, quarantine Ebola, and now COVID kind of rears its head. Today, 9.5 million people in the developing countries have access to, antiretrovirals. 3.3 million deaths from malaria have been averted, and 22 million lives have been saved from tuberculosis. So, we do find that we have made progress, although in a lot of these cases, right, progress is made alongside an increase in population, especially in Africa, right? The global populations around the world are declining. It is in Africa where we find the most increase in population. So Africa is going to remain problematic, for the foreseeable future. All right, goals 7 and 8. Well, the 8th goal, develop a global partnership for development. This is sort of an ongoing process. Not much, talking about that. As far as goal number 7, ensure environmental sustainability. This is probably one of the most important, but also one of the least achievable goals out there. By 2020, unfortunately, the indices are not as positive as the others. We have lost about 13 million hectares of forest. The amount of carbon dioxide emissions in the air has actually increased 50%. Even though about 90% of the population have access to improved drinking water, apologies for the typo there, and 2 billion people have improved sanitation. But environmental problems are still largely paramount. And even if the United States sort of rejoins the Paris Climate Accord in the wake of a hypothetical Biden victory, many of the countries are setting target dates for carbon neutral emissions long after the tipping point has been issued, right? You all have heard that we have somewhere between 12 to 15 years left to get it right before we reach a period of disaster. When countries are promising to be carbon neutral by 2050, it's already too late. We don't have 30 years. We have about 10. Right, this is the one thing that keeps me up at night. This is the one thing that kind of cements me within the political left. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, the primary issue, the primary concern, number one today, is tackling climate change, environmental regulation, environmental preservation. This is, we've got one planet, and I'm not rich enough to buy a ticket to Elon Musk's little pod on Mars. And to be perfectly honest, I don't want to spend the rest of my days on some lifeless planet with that guy, okay? I'd rather just suffocate here, Pompeii style, rather than live in some libertarian dystopian, future. So to wrap this discussion up, and I know that we've been going now for about an hour and 20, and I hope that what I've been saying is making sense here. But I want to sort of ease into the the slow lane now as we reach our exit for the week by noting some inconvenient truths about the world that we live in and the way in which economic global governance regulates, shapes, structures the world. The first inconvenient truth is that international global governance can, at best, be shaped by international institutions, right? And within the readings, mention of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the Washington Consensus, the United Nations, and other groups certainly can leave their mark and create, or at the absolute least, influence policy for what states need to do and how they need to sort of shape their next 5 to 10 years of development. But those focused on development and well-being, right, rather than economics, often lack the abilities to implement anything. So like the UN Millennial Developmental Goals, it's one thing to just simply put up in, large billboard what we would like to see. We need to eradicate, world hunger. We need to reduce the levels of extreme poverty. Great. How? Right? How do we do that? Right? At the end of the day, the one thing that we learn about the United Nations is that they are effective first and foremost in just simply raising awareness. But they don't really have the ability of making the structural changes that are necessary in target states. At the end of the day, that is left to states to make or break. But as we've also talked about, State decisions, one way or the other, is not just simply predicated on selfish and self-centered policy of some rogue leader. Oftentimes, these individuals are under enormous pressure from a collection of international influences, organizations, think tanks, lobbyists to go in 18 different directions. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that economics will win out over social well-being. So the task of promoting well-being, and that itself is a loaded term here, falls to the responsibility of the state, which, as I've just mentioned, may not be in a position to do anything because they don't have the capability. And by doing so, it might run afoul of private organizations and investors that are looking for a goal entirely different, And let's take Brazil, for instance. I know we bring up Brazil a lot in class, especially my undergrad class. And, I've made it painfully obvious that the current leader of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is one of the worst human beings running a country in the world today. If someone was to ask me who is probably the most, I would say, evil person out there, Donald Trump is nowhere near that, right? Not Kim Jong-un, not even Recep Erdogan. He's pretty decadent. He's pretty, despicable. But Jair Bolsonaro, quite possibly, is one of the worst people governing any country today for a myriad of reasons. But one of those reasons, and probably the most egregious reason, is his understanding of the Amazon rainforest as a potential golf course for the rich and affluent. Brazil has had no shortage of logging in the rainforest. And, I have read there's no week that goes by where you don't hear about the rainforest being depleted, the rainforest burning. We are reaching a point where the rainforests are actually about to transition into a savanna, which means that if that happens, you can only imagine just enormous changes to climate around the world. Now, does Bolsonaro know about these consequences? Does he care about these consequences? Or is he interested in making money? Now, the man is corrupt to the bone. There's no question about that. There's only so much money he can make. But he also sees himself as someone who wants to make Brazil the paramount state in Latin America. And right now, Brazil is in a lucrative position to do so, right? It's certainly better than, Argentina, Chile, or other countries. But is the logging of the Amazon, is the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, part of other pressures that anyone, Bolsonaro or otherwise, constantly needs to adhere to if they wish for a continuation of global investment and strategic international partnership? I mean, is Bolsonaro just simply someone who hates trees and doesn't care about the indigenous population? Or if we get rid of him, and, God willing, some point we will his successor be any better, right? And we have to take a step back here and ask, is the position of the president of Brazil one in which, yes, you are pressured by environmentalists to preserve the rainforests, but being pressured by environmentalists is nothing in comparison to being pressured by international creditors, right? So what loses out in the end? And once again, the sad, inconvenient truth is that economic solvency will always win out, or for the most part will mostly win out over democratic accountability, especially when the pressure is coming from private organizations and investors who more often than not are not only more profit-driven than concerned about social welfare, but have the leverage to get what they want, right? MNCs have much more leverage. Multinational corporations are able to get what they want especially because they're unaccountable, right? They're unaccountable, right? I mean, look, the limits of the World Health Organization are paramount in the last couple of months with what we've seen with the spread of COVID, right? The World Health Organization is, like most of these things, always a few steps behind. They're never going to be, above the curve. At the other end of the spectrum, people are looking to multinational corporations with the money and the leverage to kind of tackle these things, right? And when you look at the amount of money that, let's say, Amazon has or Microsoft, they have the ability of funding entire vaccine programs. There was, even one time or another, you talk about, LIU being financially straddled. At one point, I just sort of euphemistically opined finding Jeff Bezos' email and saying, hey, how'd you like to buy our university? How'd you like to say that you own a university in Brooklyn? How cool is that? And whatever amount of money that it costs to buy us out, it's pocket change as far as you're concerned, right? Klein could, put it for $1 billion. That's like, okay, here's exactly, he'll just deep into his pocket. Here's $1 billion. There you go. Whatever. Well, but you see, the point here is that multinational corporations have, through economic leverage, far more advantage around the world. Before we move on to the last slide, right, I want to just tell you a quick story about how Coca-Cola at one point almost saved Somalia in the early 2000s. And that was when, I think this was around 04, 05, no, I think it was 2003, 2004. Coca-Cola decides, for whatever reason that they wanted to, that they are going to build a bottling plant, a Coca-Cola bottling plant in Mogadishu, right? Probably one of the most lawless places in the world. And people are like, you got to be crazy. And Coca-Cola is like, no, hear me out. Us putting the factory in Mogadishu might actually contribute to peace and stability within the region. And what did they do? Well, first of all, they paid off the local government for whatever property, whatever land that they needed. Then they paid off a number of militia groups to suddenly serve as security guards as they're building the factory. And, when salaries are promised on a monthly basis, this is Coca-Cola, right? How much money does it really cost to purchase the loyalty of a armed paramilitia in Somalia? Probably not much if you're Coca-Cola, right? So you pay off these warlord militia groups to kind of serve as security guarding the factory. When you build a factory, guess what these militia groups become? This militia group, you become the day shift security. That militia group, you become the night shift security. And we all of a sudden start hiring people from the city to work within the factory. And you're paid a Western salary with guaranteed money every month, every week, whatever it is. And suddenly, you end up creating better well-being for the people of Mogadishu than any UN relief fund, than any food drive, than any Live Aid, than anything like that, right? You raise money for some kind of humanitarian thing, we're going to talk about this in a week or so, and you hand that money over to the state leaders, you know that money is never going to reach its intended people. Coca-Cola steps in and is just like, hey, I'm going to bypass the middleman, the local leadership, and I'm just going to employ people left and right. And for a while, it worked, right? For a while, it worked. I don't know when they shut down, but I know I don't think it's there anymore. But for a couple of years, right, it worked. And everybody was like, you see, that's the power of globalization. So, to finish this up here, some points to think about as we go into next week's discussion and we start, moving into the rest of the larger themes for, this section of class. The most active international organizations, as we've talked about, are those that are economically driven. And I think that that's not too difficult to understand, right? Money, finance, international global cooperation is largely predicated on, Pax Americana, has been a cornerstone of the United States' transatlantic network of, multi-state integration. And so it's going to naturally be, a driving force in the age of globalization. But that, in turn, sort of makes global governance of social welfare and well-being difficult to direct and implement beyond broad directives. Because the sad reality is that policies for social welfare or well-being oftentimes have to fall within the structural confines of economic-driven initiatives. And if they risk running afoul of economic initiatives, they may end up being diluted or just kind of disregarded altogether. Within this, right, individual states are still in the best positions to implement agreements and directives, but they may already be hamstrung by transnational economic commitments and restrictions. So, in other words, states are still in a primary position to do something about well-being, do something about social welfare. But as I have been hinting, doing something oftentimes means, does it conflict? Does it somehow impede pre-existing commitments to economic relations? If the answer is no, it really doesn't, well, then have at it. If it does, it's not that hard to see which will win and which will lose out. So economic globalization in this sense may actually contribute directly to problems of well-being and human development, as I mentioned in the beginning. Instead of alleviating poverty, instead of remedying a number of socio-political and socioeconomic problems, economic globalization might actually exacerbate them, deepen the differences, widen the cleavages, right? Entrench, political extremism. And solutions to address the latter that seek to reform the former, right, run into obstacles from transnational economic organizations, donor states, multinational corporations, and even private interests and enterprises with greater leverage and control over government decision-making. In other words, if all of a sudden, a global Bernie Sanders, steps up and says we need to, address world hunger, we need to address, public health in the least developed countries. We need to address the declining quality of life. We need to, better yet, we need to talk about, let's say, the formation of unions and class consciousness in order to combat the inequalities of economic globalization. He's going to get shut down, right? He is going to get shut down, just like he was unfortunately shut down here in the United States. You can threaten to build a wall. You can threaten to, promote an extremist to the Supreme Court. But if the market is not challenged, what do we care? The minute that the market suddenly is threatened with a barrier or an obstacle to unfettered capitalism, well, then we're going to just go into overdrive to defend what we feel is the status quo. And this, of course, will lead to new security dilemmas, political extremism, a rise in nationalism, and a weakening of state leadership and legitimacy. So it's not a surprise that in the advent of the age of neoliberal globalization, we begin to see also a resumption of political extremist movements and groups, a return to ethnocentric nationalism and religious fundamentalism. We begin to see, even in the most developed countries, the rise of illiberal populist parties on the right, and in a few places where, the environment is fertile, some type of old school left-wing populism, the likes of which we find with Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or the Podemos movement in Spain. These things are now becoming more and more popular to an increasing demographic that realizes upon entering adulthood that they are not going to live as good as either their parents did or as the economic marketing brochures promised them. And without any real attempts at changing the economic model in the world, and let me finish out by saying Donald Trump is no enemy of neoliberalism. He is a big, big, big fan of neoliberalism. He is a big fan of unfettered free market capitalism, as is Bolsonaro, as is Erdogan, as is almost every other tyrant on the planet, because it enriches them. But they're savvy enough in knowing that they can tap into the anger of the, ostensibly working class communities And instead of, leading them towards some kind of workers' empowerment or some kind of return to socioeconomic equity, we're just simply going to use their anger as a way of targeting more liberal-minded neoliberals within a sense of nativism, nationalism, xenophobia, and regionalism. And that has, you kind of look at the world of 2020 today and you ask yourself, how is it that this economic global model failed? And it's not because people are just angry. It's because the model deliberately empowered a small percentage of people at the direct expense of a larger percentage. And, at some point, consumerism is not going to solve all of your problems. The fact that I can get cheap crap from Best Buy might solve my immediate anger by providing a good dosage of retail therapy. But if I still don't have health care, if I still cannot provide an adequate standard of living for my children, to the point where I choose not to have children because I can't afford children, well then, you know what? There's only so many trips to Best Buy that I can do before I begin to realize the current status quo is no longer acceptable and it has to go. Okay. And that kind of leads us to where we are, right? The economics, topic is always a nice way of introducing the larger elements of what we will speak about: human rights, climate change, what else? Political extremism, conflict resolution, the rise of, regional wars and conflicts. We still have a lot of stuff to cover before the semester ends. But as this discussion has kind of indicated, we're now looking at more broad-based topics rather than just one specific organization or whatnot. So once again, I hope that you found this material informative. This was a little bit of a departure from the readings in chapter 8 and 9, but I have to be honest with you. This is that part of the textbook that gets a bit tedious because I'm thinking most of you are not really interested in the minute specific function of the World Trade Organization or, structural adjustment policies. This isn't a graduate class. I want to take some of these elements from the textbook, but apply them to some kind of understanding of, how the world is today. So at the risk of sounding elitist and full of myself, right, the textbook is certainly still a required reading, but rely a little bit more on the material from the video lecture. And if you only have time now to do one or the other, okay, rely more on the videos. And use the readings for your reading evaluations and the upcoming papers and final exam, in a couple of weeks. All right, so that is where I will leave you with for this coming weekend. Enjoy your Halloween if you celebrate, if the weather is nice and you're able to go out and you're listening before Saturday. But I will see you all in class next week, and we'll hopefully have a lot of neat things to talk about. So take care for now.